Hello, welcome to the BYU-Idaho Tutoring Center videos. The topic of today's video is beginning of evolution, and specifically the people that helped influence and generate ideas that helped Darwin ultimately come up with his idea of evolution, or as he called it, descent with modification. So the first person we're going to talk about is Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. Hopefully you've at least heard of him. He viewed life as fixed, so he didn't think organisms changed at all. But he did recognize that there were some similarities among different organisms. And so he arranged organisms on what he called a scale of nature, from increasingly complexity, and every organism had its rung or place, and humans were at the top. But each organism was permanent on that certain rung. And so then later, about 1,000 or so years later, we had Linus come around, and he also saw some of these similarities, and so he sought to classify organisms as well, and he also saw life as fixed. But instead of doing this ladder type thing, he instead organized organisms in the two-part binomial system that we still have today, and it was a nested classification system. So he grouped similar organisms into increasingly more general categories. So for example, Homo sapiens is humans, and so we're in the Homo genus and sapiens species, and so that's a system we still use today. The next person is Hunton. So Hunton was one of the a prominent geologist, and he came up with ideas of gradualism, and basically what gradualism said is that the things that have created the landforms we see on Earth today were really slow, gradual processes, and that the gradual mechanisms used to create them back then are the ones still being used today. And so his argument helped to potentially argue for an older age of the Earth than a lot of people were thinking, because in order for the landforms to be how they were today, the Earth would have to be a lot older than people commonly believed. The next person is Lamarck. Now Lamarck is the first person who actually came up for a mechanism for evolution. There was quite a few people at the time that were supporting evolution, but nobody had really tried to explain how it happens. But it's important to note that his mechanism is actually incorrect. That's why Darwin is the founder of evolution and not Lamarck. But we still give him credit for recognizing that the evolution explains the differences in the fossil record, and also that organisms match their environment. So he still gets credit for that. But the two parts of his mechanism for evolution were based on use and disuse and inheritance of acquired characteristics. So use and disuse basically said that if an organism had certain characteristics as it used them, they'd become stronger and more prominent, and as it didn't use certain characteristics, they would deteriorate. And then inheritance of acquired characteristics just took this one step further and said that any characteristics that an organism developed during its lifetime would pass that on to its offspring. So he used giraffes as an example. This is my lovely drawing. And he believed that as giraffes stretched their neck to reach to higher foliage for food, they got longer with use, and then they would pass that on to their children, who just continued to get them longer and longer and longer. And so another example of this would be, like to say, if somebody got really buff in their lifetime, then they had children, all their children would be buff. Or if somebody had purple hair, then all their children would have purple hair. And we know that those ideas are false now because of genetics, but they had not as many ideas of genetics at that time. The next person is Cuvier, and he was kind of around the same time as a lot of these guys. He's a developer of paleontology, which is the study of fossils, which was actually really important for Darwin's theory, because a lot of the evidence for evolution actually comes from the fossil record. But unlike some of these guys, he did not believe in evolution at all. He did not believe that organisms changed. He believed them as fixed, like these two guys. And so instead of this idea that they're slow, gradual, the same processes over millions of years, he believed that the changes that were seen in the fossil record were due to catastrophic events that occurred by mechanisms that we don't see today. His ideas are actually false as well. The next person is Lyell, and Lyell was also a geologist, and he used a lot of Hunton's ideas to come up with this idea of uniformitarianism, and that's really similar to gradualism. Basically, it just says that the mechanisms that create the geological changes today were the same that operated back then. And this becomes very important. Darwin gets a lot of his ideas from uniformitarianism. So now on to the big man, Darwin. Just some random facts about Darwin. Darwin originally tried to go into medical school, but he didn't survive. He also ironically went into the monastery, but that didn't work out. He ended up just kind of going to school, and his botany professor was the one that actually suggested him to go on this trip with Captain Robert Fitzroy. And they went on this trip to South America, and one of their stops included the Galapagos Islands. And they were just doing a survey, but Darwin collected a lot of plant and animal samples. And he noticed a lot of interesting things on his trip, that a lot of the species and animals that he was seeing in these other parts of the world were very different from the ones he saw in England, and that they were also more specialized to their environment. And so he took a lot of these ideas. When he went back to England, he came up with all this evidence and this ideas of descent with modification, that species do change over, not species, sorry, individuals do change, sorry, not individuals, populations do change over time, species do change over time, depending on their environment. And part of that, he came up with this idea of natural selection. Anyway, but Darwin was really reluctant to publish his findings because he knew it would cause an uproar. A lot of people disagreed very strongly with evolution. But Lyell, who was actually friends of Darwin's at the time, was telling him that he really needed to publish his work, or somebody else might publish or some similar findings, and then he wouldn't get any credit for all this work he'd done. And Lyell's prediction actually came true, because Wallace, another scientist at the time, actually sent his work to Darwin, because Darwin was one of the prominent scientists on evolution at the time, to ask him what he thought of his ideas. And Darwin read them and was like, darn it, these are exactly what he almost proposed, the same ideas as Darwin. So that got Darwin to quickly finish and publish his book on the origin of species that goes over these ideas of evolution and descent with modification. And even though Wallace actually published his findings first, Darwin is still given credit because he developed the ideas so extensively with so much evidence, much more than Wallace. So that's all we're really going to talk about for today, but in other lecture videos, I'll go more in depth onto what Darwin's theory of evolution was, particularly natural selection, and we'll also go into some of the evidence that supports his theory. But just make sure you have a general idea of what each of these men supported and how their ideas helped influence Darwin. For example, this idea of uniformitarianism. If the slow processes that happen the same as they did in the past could make geological changes, then slow processes could also make changes to species. So that's just one idea of how these ideas helped Darwin. Thank you for watching, and that's all.